I'm Tom Clays, president of the Santa Monica Conservancy, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for the last of our 3 fall lectures. Some of you are familiar with the Conservancy's mission, but for those of you that are not, the Conservancy is a historic preservation organization, much like the LA Conservancy or the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're an educational and advocacy group that focuses on Santa Monica and the immediately surrounding area. Through our efforts for the last 18 years, we have become the leading voice in the community for embracing historic preservation and adaptive reuse while celebrating all our historic communities and their memories. We want to thank our sponsor, Redcar, and Jim Jacobson, its owner, for making this fall lecture series possible. Redcar is a local firm that invests in urban commercial real estate in Los Angeles, specializing in adaptive reuse and redevelopment with a commitment to sustainable, ethical, and responsible investment. With that, I want to turn it over to Libby Motika, our moderator, to start the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome. We conclude this season's Mosaic series with the Rancho Period, whose history and culture have probably implanted the most visible result record on the Southern California landscape, and which has contributed a vital piece to the mosaic we call Santa Monica. Today, we will be addressing the Mexican land grant period that spanned the years 1822 to 1846. Our speaker, Chris Vargas, will explain the development of the Mexican era and invite us to experience life on the rancho, both economic and social. A Los Angeles native, Chris is the president of the Montebello Historical Society. His areas of expertise include the U.S.-Mexican War from 1846 to 1848, the Mission period, and 19th century in Alta California. Following Chris's lecture, I will offer a brief history of the Rancho Boca de Santa Monica, which includes parts of Santa Monica Canyon and Santa Monica Beach and east as far as Sullivan Canyon. I will highlight the Marquez and Reyes pioneers, their enterprises, life on the rancho, and their descendants' efforts to preserve what remains of the land grant area. Following our lectures, I would like to invite the audience to contribute questions and answers by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now I would like to present Chris Vargas.
Good evening. My name is Chris Vargas, and I'm with the Montebello Historical Society. I want to thank the Santa Monica Conservancy for inviting me to speak on the subject of Los Ranchos in Alta California. I also want to thank the historians and scholars whose shoulders I stand on when addressing the subject of Los Ranchos. Before the Spanish arrived in 1769 to colonize Alta California, native peoples thrived or flourished. California had one of the highest concentrations of tribes and languages in North America. Estimates range from 133,000 to 705,000, with some recent scholars concluding that these estimates are low. The Spanish colonial period begins in 1769, a seismic shift for native peoples of California, with 2 prior navigational expeditions before the Holy Expedition of 1769. So before we get to the ranchos during the Mexican period, we need to go back about 50 plus years. And just a quick definition for those of you who aren't familiar with the 1769 Portola expedition, that is the date where the Spanish decided that they were going to colonize California, and Father Serra and his staff began the building of missions. The Spanish were very meticulous in terms of social structures, record keeping, and developing laws and regulations. When they arrived in the New World looking for precious metals and souls to convert to Christianity, they had developed laws covering the issue of land granting. And just a quick definition of what a land grant is. A land grant is a gift of the real estate land or its use privileges made by a government and or other authority. Unlike other countries of Western Europe, Spain had a history of land granting resulting from the capture of Spanish territories lost to the Muslims during the Middle Ages. Traditionally, land grants were provided to soldiers as a reward for their service, retired soldiers, veterans. The Spanish had developed laws addressing land granting, a document or body of laws called Recopilación de las Leyes de los Reinos de Indias, or Laws of the Indies, would serve as a guide. But the land granted was in the king's name and was only a lease one could hold for life with no payments required. The first land grant was provided to Manuel Butrón, a soldier with the 1769 Portola expedition in Alta California in the year 1775. But Butrón went to San Jose, thereby abandoning the property and losing the property or land grant. And just a real brief explanation in terms of how to get a land grant back then. One had to fill out a petition. You had to fill in your name, your religion, and of course you had to be Catholic, your occupation, and for the most part they were soldiers, residents, family size, and available livestock. The obligations once you received a land grant was to build a home, an adobe, have livestock and crops. No other land grants were provided until 1784. In 1784, the beneficiaries of the next three land grants were soldiers from the San Diego Presidio. Now, Presidio is just a fortress or military fort that were built near missions to protect them from native uprisings and or foreign invaders, in particular the English and the Russians. Rancho San Pedro, the first grantee was Juan Jose Dominguez. He was part of the Portola 1769 expedition. And you can see that the present location is San Pedro, Palos Verdes, and some of the other nearby cities. Rancho San Rafael, that was given to Jose Maria Verdugo. And some of these names are familiar with named after, these names are Verdugo Street and other sites throughout Los Angeles. And the last one, Rancho Los Nietos. These first three land grants created the fledgling dons that would be the precursor to the great ranchos of the 1830s, 1840s. All three land grants were veterans and were part of Governor Fages' command. Governor Fages was the military commander, governor of California at the time. Military Governor Fages thus transformed elements of the military into an economic elite and initiated the Rancho era of California history. At most, there were approximately 30 land grants provided during the Spanish period, 1769, 1822. In 1821, Mexico finally gained its independence after 10 plus years of war and revolution. But the ranchos of the 1820s were not yet as important to California production, society, and history as they would become after secularization, which is coming up, when their numbers increased tremendously. In the decade after Mexican independence, the number of ranchos in California doubled from about 25 to 50. This era would begin the formation of a group of ruling families in Alta California. The 1820s and early 1830s would be the beginning of a new ruling elite in Alta California, which had formed as a result of a small group of intermarried land-owning families. They would make up the core of the new California power brokers, the rancheros. Most were second-generation Californios, part of the original colonizing families who arrived in California during the 1770s with Juan Bautista de Anza expedition, and as far back as the Portola expedition of 1769. Their fathers were soldiers in the Spanish army. And just a quick note, Juan Bautista de Anza was a officer in the Spanish army, and he is noted for finding a overland route to Alta California to colonize Alta California during the 1770s. The struggle for power between church and state started from the beginning of Spanish colonization in Alta California, dating back to the 1770s. In 1833, the Mexican Congress passed the necessary legislation to carry out the dismantling and expropriation of mission assets in Alta California, including the emancipation of the indigenous peoples at the missions. A primary principle of the Secularization Act was, quote, convert each mission Indian community into a self-governing town with communal land holding. But the natives got the short end of the stick, or actually no stick at all. The missions held the region's most valuable real estate at the expense of impoverished settlers and ambitious Californios. California settlers resented the missionaries. A commission was formed in Alta California to administer the distribution, expropriation of mission properties. The committee members were the new political elite that would administer land and other assets of the missions. Some of these men included Pio Pico in the South, and Pio Pico, I think most of us may know that he was the last Mexican governor of California, and Mariano Vallejo in the North, and they were appointed by the California governor at the time, California Governor Figueroa. There were great numbers of livestock, horses, cattle, sheep, and other animals, tens of thousands, crops, and millions of acres of mission property. And important to the rancheros, a readily available pool of labor from the natives from the missions. The process implemented by the commission to redistribute mission properties was very corrupt, enriching themselves. It was a very rapid process. Mission natives, as I mentioned earlier, got the short end of the stick, and it was akin to the foxes guarding the hen house. And here are some of the families that benefited from the dismantling of the missions. Most of these names are fairly familiar for those of us in Los Angeles. Thus, we enter the great Rancho era. In the late 19th century through part of the 20th century, historians used a standard narrative of Los Ranchos during the Mexican period to romanticize and idealize and project a pastoral paradise or utopia, with cattle roaming the lush green pastures, a life of leisure and idleness. Here we have a very regal-looking ranchero, dignified and meticulously dressed, illustrating my point above. One of the preeminent pioneer historians to promote this fantasy heritage was Hubert Howe Bancroft, and I quote him, "Never before or since," Bancroft eulogized, "was there a spot in America where life was a long and happy holiday, where there was less labor, less care or trouble than in Alta California." He regarded the Spanish and Mexican eras of California, the golden age. Other individuals that promoted this fantasy heritage included Charles F. Loomis, and some of us have probably heard of him. He has an Adobe right off the Pasadena freeway. He's another individual that promoted that. And one of the reasons to promote that, at least from Mr. Loomis, was to get people to come to California. He was considered a booster to increase tourism in California. However, I want to take a closer look at the ranchos through a different window to provide a broader, clearer social, economic, and cultural historical picture. So let's focus on four of the larger and prominent ranchos owned and operated by some very influential Californios. Jose Antonio Carrillo, a very prominent Angelino. His father was part of the Portola expedition of 1769. He served as an alcalde, which is sort of a mayor back then. And remember, I talked about how these landowning families intermarried. Well, Jose Antonio Carrillo married a Pio Pico sister, Estevana. And when she passed away, he married another Pio Pico sister, Jacinta Pico. And also, I want to note that Carrillo distinguished himself during the Mexican War here in California at the Battle of Rio San Gabriel in January of 1847. Mariano Vallejo, the godfather of the North, a high-ranking California general, statesman, close ties with native tribes in the North. His parents lived at the Santa Barbara Mission in 1791, and his nephew was an Alta California governor, Juan Bautista Alvarado, from 1836 to 1843. Here we have an older picture, later picture of Pio Pico. His father was also here in Alta California in the 1770s, and he was a Spanish soldier at the San Gabriel Mission. He served as governor. He not only was he the last governor of Mexican California, but he also served like a 2-month term in 1832. His brother was a well-noted Californian, Andres Pico, and he was the leader at the Battle of San Pascual in December of 1847, part of the Mexican-American War here in California. Then we have Mr. Bandini. Bandini was from Peru. He was a sailor and sailed ships. He served in various public offices, such as the Assembly, and he was a substitute congressman. But what about the ranchos in the west side? Well, there were a few ranchos in the west side, and let's briefly go through them. Here we have Rancho La Baluna, and the grantee was Agustin Machado. You can see that's in Santa Monica. It kind of crosses the Santa Monica Freeway or San Diego Freeway all the way to the Santa Monica Bay. It's a fairly large amount of land, 13,000 acres. And finally, we have a woman. Women did receive land grants. There were probably 60 of them during the 19th century. And here we have Maria Rita Quinteros Valdez. The name of her rancho is Rancho Rodea Las Aguas. She was the granddaughter of one of the original settlers of Los Angeles. And all of us have heard of Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. You see the beautiful dress that she has on in the painting and the collar. And then we have Rancho San Vicente y Santa Monica. And the grantee there was Francisco Sepulveda. And then here, just real quickly on the left-hand side, this is a diseño, and this is a map of the land that they, as part of the land grant. So this was another segment or obligation that one had to perform, was to draw a map to show the boundaries. Now let's talk about the rancho economy. But before that, I'd like to make a couple of points about trade and what resulted as a result of independence from Spain. Independence from Spain relaxed the old crown regulations against foreign trade. And the Spanish crown had some very strict rules on trading and didn't allow any foreign trading. So it really hindered the economy of California. But after independence, foreign flagships brought trading goods needed in Alta California from China, England, and the US. With the rise of manufacturing in the 19th century, a global market was formed. Alta California's great surplus of cattle products, that is, cattle hides and tallow, was rapidly recognized as a profitable export, readily exchangeable for foreign merchandise. And just a few characteristics to better understand the ranchos of California. The economic focus was on livestock, agriculture, and manufacturing, self-sufficiency and trade, and, as I mentioned earlier, native Californian Indians. Vast tracts of land, the ranchos, tens of thousands of cattle, and it would be the rancho that would rule this era. Hides became a commodity to trade with foreigners. Hides went through a very labor-intensive process done by what's called a tanner. First, the cow had to be slaughtered, killed, and when they would kill these cows or cattle, they called it la matanza, the killing, and they would kill thousands of them at one time throughout Southern California. The cattle or carcass had to be skinned. The hide had to be scraped to get rid of the hair. It had to be stretched. You had to cure it in some sort of dye. It had to be cleaned and then laid out in the sun to dry. Hides became known in California as California banknotes, and that's what they were referred to by U.S. sailors and other foreigners who came to trade. They were used as money. People on the ranchos traded the hides for all the things they needed. And we have to keep in mind that Alta California during the 1830s and 1840s was the frontier. There was no real manufacturing. There were no banks. There were no real markets or stores. And so people depended on the foreign ships coming to trade for the hides. And what would they need? Well, household goods, furniture, kitchenware, clothes, and saddles. They even used hides as well as tallow and sometimes grain to pay their taxes to the Mexican government. One hide would yield anywhere from $1 to $2.50, from $2.50. And what were hides used for? Well, they were used to make shoes, belts, rope, saddles, and even door hinges. Then we have tallow, and basically that is just melted animal fat. And this was another primary business activity in California during the Rancho period. A family's wealth was counted in the number of cattle they owned, and the value of the cattle was in the hides and tallow. And there wasn't yet a market for the meat, because we have to keep in mind there was no refrigeration, so there was no way of keeping the meat fresh. There wasn't a market with the cattle until the gold rush of 1849. Then cattle, the cost of a cow or cattle increased from $15 to $60. Tallow, in terms of a carcass, would yield anywhere from 75 to 100 pounds from each carcass. And depending on the market, you would get anywhere from 6 cents per pound, maybe to 10 cents a pound. And what was tallow used for? It was used to make candles, soap. Native people served as the primary labor force in the ranchos. keeping in mind that many native peoples from the mission system had been trained in many skilled labor tasks. And again, a readily available source of labor for ranchos. Many natives had been trained as leather workers, trained in metal, carpenters, tile making, cobblers, blacksmiths, worked in the fields, and did the general housework. They were trained in different rancho chores, and native labor ran the day-to-day operations of the ranchos. Native labor was essential to making the ranchos what they were. Some historians have referred to the native people's labor and relationship with the rancheros as a form or state of peonage, debt slavery, debt servitude, unfree labor. Finally, food. We all like to eat, but what did the people at the ranchos in the 19th century eat? Well, we know one thing, given that there were tens of thousands of cattle, they ate beef, and they ate quite a bit of it. But there were also crops such as corn, wheat, and barley. So we know they made tortillas, flour and corn, and they made bread. And the ranch hands would maintain vegetable gardens, onions, chilies, tomatoes, squash. According to a European American observer, William Heath Davis, and I quote him, breakfast might be a solid meal consisting of carne asada, which is a beef steak, with a rich gravy or onions, eggs, beans, tortillas, and sometimes bread. Coffee was often made of peas, or for lighter fare for breakfast, atole. And atole is a thick gruel, kind of like a cream of wheat, and you would eat that with tortillas, or a hot chocolate drink made with water or milk. Dishes were prepared using a variety of techniques. For example, smoking, baking, frying, roasting, steaming. What type of beverages would people drink? Well, they drank atole, tea, coffee, red wine, lemonade, sarsaparilla, and this was a surprise to me, ginger beer, chocolate, and brandy. And if you look to the far bottom right, that is an horno, that's an oven. That's where during that period of time, people would cook and bake their food. But there weren't any like ovens or stoves in people's houses because they were concerned about fire. So a lot of the cooking would have been done outside with the horno. Meals would usually start off with a prayer in many households. The men ate first. Other foods consumed would have been pozole, and they made it with beef. Most people in Los Angeles today make it with pork. I like mine with chicken. Beans were a staple dish, tamales. And there was one observer, and I would recommend this book. He was a little critical of the Californios, Richard Henry Dana, and he was a sailor who kept a journal, and he eventually published it, called 2 Years Before the Mast. He talks about beans, and I quote him, "I went to the house to supper. We had frijoles, beans, the perpetual food of the Californians, but which, when well cooked, are the best beans in the world. Other foods, squash, chilies, flour tortillas, cakes, bread, dried beef, and toasted corn kernel." And second to cattle were sheep. There were tens and thousands of sheep, so they ate a lot of mutton, chicken, and seafood. For ceremonial events, such as a baptism, you would have a light fare, perhaps a chocolate drink with tortillas or wheat bread. Sugar was primarily imported and in the forms of cones known as panoche. Rancho culture and lifestyles have been written about and illustrated for generations. As mentioned earlier, the Rancho era has been romanticized and embellished to show an image of gaiety and a continuous celebration. But putting that aside, an important point to address about life in California is isolation. A primary element to an understanding the early Californians and the society in which they lived is isolation. And when I say isolation, I mean isolation geographically. They were almost 1,900 miles from Mexico City. Economically, they got very little funding from the capital. Culturally and socially, all of this tremendously shaped the social conditions existing at the time in early California. Because of this isolation, the Californians had to fall back on their own resources for entertainment and art. And one of the distractions to entertain themselves with dancing. And here we have a couple of photographs of dancing. You'll see the picture, the larger picture to the right. This is a fandango. And you can see, if you look at this close enough and you understand California history a bit, you can see that this was after the Mexican-American War, because you can see that there are European Americans in military uniforms. And the fandango dances started off as an open event to which all were welcome, but gradually it became a public dance, an event of the lowest order. And it was the baile, which became an exclusive event. And this was an event that would have been for the ranchos, rancheros, the elites of California. Again, the majestic ranchero on top of his horse and saddle. Many saddles were silver mounted, embroidered with silver or gold. The bridle heavily mounted with silver, and reins made of the most select hair of the horse's mane. They wore hats imported from Mexico or Peru, generally stiff, the finer quality. Women. The style of women's dresses were conservative. The rise of trade brought in the latest styles. And here we have a beautiful painting of Maria de Jesus. And she was married to the gentleman that made that observation about food, William Heath Davis. And you can see she has gloves on, and those were very popular in the 80s. And you can see that she also has a fan. Fans were extremely popular in the 19th century across the globe. And they had their own sort of language. Women had to be extremely discreet. There was flirting, but you had to be very discreet about it. And the fan was a way of talking. It had its own little language, and I have a little example here. And this is compliments of a friend of mine, Dennis Carlos. We have pamphlets where I volunteer at the Sanchez Adobe here in Montebello. Societal role of women in the 19th century. Women were the nurturer, enforcer, and upholder for the formation of a family, as well as individuals with their own private recreation and amusements. Women during this period of time would give birth from anywhere from 10, 15, 20 children, but infant child mortality rate was extremely high. Some women would lose up to 5 children out of 15 births. And I can't even imagine losing one child, less 5 children. But that was a way of life, because we have to understand that there was no modern medicine. There were no hospitals. There may have been a doctor or somebody who understood how to care for somebody, but there was no medical facilities to treat somebody that was sick. The women, although small of stature, exerted strong domination over family life, Pio Pico once said, that until he was 26 years old, and I will quote him, "I was in complete subjugation to my mother. My father being dead, when younger, I could repeat the whole catechism from beginning to the end, and she would send for me to do so for the edification of strangers." And here are some pictures, old photograph of Mariano Vallejo's nieces. You can see the beautiful hair. Look how long that hair is. William Heath Davis wrote, quote, "During my long and intimate acquaintance with Californians, I have found the women as a class much brighter, quicker in their perceptions, and generally smarter than the men." Mr. Davis continues with, "Their husbands oftentimes look to them for advice, direction in their general business affairs." And as I mentioned, 60 women or so received grants, and this is a grant that a Casilda Soto de Lobo for Rancho La Merced, the Sanchez Adobe, and this is where I serve as a docent. So in closing, reflecting on history can be complicated, not always clear, but instructive and enlightening. It can be intellectually rewarding. And for me, it's a way of traveling back in time to get a feel for how people lived and how they felt. Our state's history is deep and goes back before 1769, before California. And I want to thank you for your attention. And now I want to turn it over to my co-panelist, Libby Montica.
Thank you, Chris. You have laid a good foundation for my little talk on the Rancho Boca de Santa Monica. In the 1830s, Santa Monica lands offered ample grazing from Santa Monica Canyon to Topanga and inland. And in this picture, we're looking east from the canyon. And if you're very, very sharp-eyed, you can see some cattle roaming on the hillside in front of you, which would essentially be the hill that goes up to Ocean Avenue today in Palisades Park. One more item about this, and notice how much sand is in the mouth of the canyon. It went way back. We've lost a lot of sand over the years. This territory would become the foundation of Rancho Boca de Santa Monica, so named because it included the mouth of Santa Monica Canyon. It extended over 6,657 acres, stretching from Topanga Canyon eastward along the coast to present-day Montana and to Sullivan Canyon to the east. In 1838, the petitioners, Francisco Marquez and Isidro Reyes, applied to the governor of Monterey for formal ownership. Next slide. And you can see, just I was going to show you the little picture of the Boca de Santa Monica, which, as you can see, is completely surrounded like a hamburger bun by the San Vicente Santa Monica Rancho. While we don't know what brought these two men together, they both lived in Los Angeles and established businesses downtown. Reyes, born in Los Angeles in 1811, owned one of the largest vineyards downtown and operated a business transporting brea, or tar, from the tar pits at Rancho La Brea to homes for use as roofing material. Marquez, born in Mexico in 1798, came to Los Angeles in 1825, which was still under Spanish control. He set up a blacksmith and harness shop on Calle Principal, which is Main Street downtown. To obtain a land grant, applicants had to be of Mexican descent, of good character, and Catholic. They had to agree to build a house, plant fruit trees on the land, and stock the rancho with at least 150 head of cattle. Their petition accepted, Marquez and Reyes received title to the land in 1839. Next slide. Marcos and his wife Roque Valenzuela and their son Manuel moved to Santa Monica Canyon, where they built an adobe house on the upper mesa where San Lorenzo is today. Next slide. It was the first permanent structure built in the canyon. There, Marquez opened another blacksmith shop and continued to live and work on the rancho until his death in 1850. He and Roque had 11 children. Meanwhile, Reyes constructed his first ranch house west of Rustic Canyon, which would be today's Pacific Palisades. Later, in 1832, he built another house that would be roughly at the corner of 7th and Adelaide. Like his partner, Reyes had a big family, raising 11 children with his wife, Maria Antonia. The partnership between the families was further settled by the marriage of Marcos's son, Pascual, and Reyes's daughter, Micaela. While the land once occupied by Rancho Boca de Santa Monica today is probably the most expensive in the world, it was considered the hinterlands in the early 19th century. Next slide. Here you see the canyon. Now we're looking west towards up the coast, and you do see a few tents. These would have been for daily visitors who would set up and enjoy the beach, enjoy the water. But for most part, it was pretty uninhabited. Distances necessitated the rancho to be completely self-sufficient, providing its own water, food, school, and even cemetery. Remember, the rancho was more than a day's trip from the cemetery at San Gabriel Mission and the Plaza Church in Los Angeles. So to provide a respectful burial, Francisco Marquez set aside a portion of his land for a family cemetery within view of his adobe house. Next slide. This is Canyon School on opening day, 1894. Canyon School has been a fully operating part of LAUSD from the very beginning. Now it serves as the school's library. But if you go down through the canyon, you can see that it looks pretty much like it always did in 1894. Next slide. This is the one-room classroom in 1911. And you can see that there are both Mexican children and Anglo children. That was a very typical classroom at the onset. And then there's the teacher in the back sitting at her desk. Next slide. This is Pedro Marquez. Pedro was Pascual's son, and he is standing in the cemetery in front of one of the original crosses. Though long gone, it shows what it looked like. It was very, very sparse back in the day. Although the rancho was both sparsely settled and remote, the Californios, or the rancheros, created their own diversions, organized fiestas around important events, such as weddings, the roundup of cattle, or religious holidays. Next slide. Here we see some pioneers arriving in the canyon for a barbecue. If you look to the left of the gentleman with the white suit, you will see a man holding a long stick. This is Pascual Marquez. Generous hospitality was a hallmark of rancho culture. Visitors were welcome, given a meal and a fresh horse to continue their journey. In 1861, Isidro Reyes died, leaving his undivided one-half interest in the rancho to his wife, Maria, who in 1872 sold that share to Colonel Robert S. Baker for $6,000. Baker was less interested in raising livestock than imagining a port city which would link by railroad to Los Angeles. While this dream never really came to pass, it was a harbinger of the drive toward the ultimate breakup of the ranchos. Land rich, but increasingly cash poor, the land grant families had little choice but to sell their properties at low prices to meet the expenses of a developing California. The Marquez family members retained their share of the rancho, which was partitioned in 3 allotments, one for residential, one for grazing, and a smaller portion at the mouth of the canyon for business. Next slide. This was the first bathhouse on Santa Monica Beach. It was built by Michael Duffy in 1876 and had 2 structures with 16 rooms with their own freshwater bath and shower. It closed in 1892. The wagon you see in front of the bathhouse was typical of the wagons that transported visitors from downtown Los Angeles to the beach before the arrival of the railroad. Pascual Marquez's portion in Santa Monica Canyon included his house, the remains of the family adobe where he was born in 1844, and the family cemetery. Today little remains of the original Mexican land grant in the Marquez family, except the cemetery and a house owned by Marquez descendant Sharon Kilbride, whose great-grandfather Miguel Marquez built it in 1902. Sharon's mother remodeled it in 1940. Next slide. All that remains is the basement of the original 1902 house. In 1926, the Santa Monica Land and Water Company began to subdivide the area for residential development, further threatening the cemetery. At that point, the Marquez family decided that the cemetery should be preserved and protected. Dorothy Gillis Lummis, daughter of Robert Gillis, who was the owner of the Santa Monica Land and Water Company, commissioned renowned architect John Byers to design a Spanish Revival style adobe wall to be built around the perimeter of the cemetery. Next slide. Well, there was a 4-foot wide easement running down the center of the front lot to the cemetery entrance. The front lot itself was threatened with the construction of a new house in 2009. Concern that the front property might contain more burials prompted a call to action. Neighbors rallied, and with a robust fundraiser, supporters bought access parts of the land in front of the cemetery, thus saving a resting place that has been lovingly cared for by the family for over 160 years. In this picture, you see the headstone of Pascual and Micaela. Pascual was the last person buried in the cemetery, and you can see in 1916. There were probably 33 graves that were identified, both Marquez family members and people who worked on the rancho. Marquez descendants continue to oversee and maintain the cemetery, which was designated a registered cultural historical monument in 2000. The cemetery graves, which were located and identified through electronic imaging, are now marked with handcrafted crosses made by the grandson of Pascual Marquez, Ernie Marquez, who has dedicated his life to preserving the history of the family's Rancho Boca de Santa Monica. Next slide. It is to Ernie and his son and to Sharon and other members of the Marquez family that I am indebted for not only the history that I have gleaned from about the family, but also for these wonderful historic pictures that Ernie has so kindly offered us. And now I will open up the program to questions from the audience, and we will begin. The first question is, what was the approximate population of both rancheros and indios? Chris, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, My understanding with regard to the number of rancheros, and I don't know if you mean Californios, but the population in Alta California was never high. I seen estimates anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 Californios or non-natives. In terms of natives, I don't have that count available. That's something I'd have to look up.
Thank you. This question is there a cookbook or resource of Rancho Period recipes that you know of?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, a couple of sources. One good source, and I'll show you the book in a couple of seconds here. One good source is go to Facebook and do a search for a Facebook page, and it's called Alta California Foods. And that is a very good site to get an understanding of what people ate in California during the 1830s, 40s. So it's called Alta California Food. In terms of a book, I don't know if you can see this, but here's a book by it's a cookbook by a woman during the 19th century. And I'm not quite sure if you can see it all.
We can see it.
Here's the title. And this was recommended by a scholar on Alta California food in the 19th century. So if you're going to get, and you can get this on Amazon, I would highly recommend this. It doesn't give a lot, it gives some history, but it has a bunch of recipes on it. I haven't done any of them yet, but I would recommend this one if you're going to do a recipe or if you want a cookbook.
Thank you. Chris, this is for you. Thank you, Chris. I heard you pronouncing various names in proper Mexican Spanish, but I've heard that the 18th and 19th century Californians spoke a different form of Spanish. Los banos, for example, was pronounced more like los banus. Can you comment on that?
You know, unfortunately, I know that they had a different dialect. And as I mentioned earlier during my lecture, that the Californios were isolated, and so they had to form their own culture and way of cooking and just way of life. So I would assume that they acquired their own sort of idioms and language and dialect. But that's an interesting subject. But I don't really know a whole bunch about it. But I would say that given their isolation, given that they were pretty much on their own, they had to form their own culture. And I assume they formed their own little dialect separate from how Spanish was spoken in Mexico at the time.
Thank you. Chris, I'm going to give this one to you. What was the reason for the financial demise of the rancheros? You mentioned they were land rich and cash poor.
One of the problems that they had, well, a couple of reasons. After the annexation of California by the Americans during the Mexican-American War, and in 1851, there was the I forget the exact name, but it involved trying to figure out the boundaries and adjudicate all these different land grants that these Californios had received during the Mexican period. And as Libby noted, they had a lot of land, but they didn't have a lot of cash. And remember during my lecture, their form of currency was cattle hides and tallow. And once that market started to dip, they didn't have accessibility to cash or to goods. And when they went through this adjudication in 1851 of their land grants, they had to give up not money, but parcels of their land. So that was one big reason for a lot of these rancheros losing a lot of their property and becoming not as rich during the American period.
Okay. This question is, where is the Marquez Cemetery located approximately? The Marquez Cemetery is located on San Lorenzo in Santa Monica Canyon. Alas, it is not open to the public except by very difficult ways, but you can see it from the street. It has a beautiful native California garden in the front and a plaque which shows that it's a cultural registered monument.
And just, can I add a footnote to that one question? That was the land grant, the Land Act of 1851 that was initiated by one of our first senators, Senator Gwynn. And that contributed to the demise of the rancheros and the vast land tracts that they held. The Land Act of 1851.
There's another question that has something to do with that, Chris. Can you briefly address the breakup of the ranchero properties and the Homestead Acts?
Well, I don't know much about the Homestead Acts, but I can tell you that during the latter part of the 1840s, some of these vast land grants or tracts of land that were provided were broken up by the last two governors of Mexico, Mexican California. And again, once the annexation of California occurred, then there were a lot of legal maneuvers to really take a hard look at the property. One thing that you have to note is that the boundaries of these land grants were fairly ambiguous. Some of the boundaries would be, for example, a rock to the left, an oak tree, and or a skeleton head of a cattle. So that was one of the reasons. And again, it was the Land Act of 1851 that contributed to the demise of the ranchos and the breaking up of these large land grants. Because again, they didn't have money. What they had was land, so they had to give up parcels of the land to pay the lawyers to try to keep their property.
Chris, I'd like to add that there was a controversy, a long-running controversy between the Sepulveda land grant, Santa Monica and San Vicente, and the Rancho Boca de Santa Monica, and it went on forever. The Sepulveda land grant was issued in 1828 before the Marquez land grant, and it was finally settled toward the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, litigation, again, the Land Act of 1851, the litigation went on for years, 10, 15 years. And for those of us who, I work at a law firm, so I understand how expensive lawyers are. But when you have litigation that goes on for 10, 15 years, it's going to cost some money. And one of the other issues that came about was the gold rush of 1849, when everybody from the world came upon California, and you had what you called land squatters. And people would just squat on land and take it with no regard for the owner.
Did the Civil War have an impact on the rancheros?
That's an interesting question. The Civil War, well, here's one impact, but let me give a little bit of historical context. In the early 1860s, there was a drought, and it pretty much destroyed the cattle industry. And we still have droughts. We have a drought now. We haven't had any rain for quite some time. But as a result, sheep, and I'll lead into the Civil War, sheep became a commodity during the Civil War because of the blockade of the South. It's called the Anaconda Plan, where they blockaded the South. So there was no, you couldn't export cotton to like Britain and some of these other foreign countries. So a lot of these rancheros, and in particular, I'll talk about Rancho La Merced, the Sanchez adobe, where I serve as a docent. He was one of the leading producers of sheep wool. And so the rancheros were able to sort of revive themselves as a result of the drought, the Civil War, and the sheep that they had.
There was a legend of a woman, Juanita de Castro, known as the White Rose of Santa Monica, throwing herself off the cliffs for unrequited love for a sailor who found her and killed himself. Is there any grain of truth to this story?
You know, I've not heard of that particular story, but you recall that I briefly talked about the romanticizing and the embellishing of California life during the 1830s, 1840s. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to do some research on that. But I will say that if you are interested in this subject, the history of California in the 19th century, and I know I talked about him, I wasn't trying to disparage him, Hubert Bancroft, he's one of the pillars of California history, and he has a 7-volume set on the history of California. So I'd recommend getting that a set of volumes, because he sent an army of interviewers to interview the old Californios, and it's a good resource. But as for that story, I can't say yes or no on that one.
Okay, this is the last question. Did any Indios intermarry with rancheros?
Yeah, there were a lot of, that's one interesting point about California is as opposed to what was happening in the United States, there wasn't a lot of interracial marrying in the United States. But in California, California during the 19th century, European American men would come to California and marry Californios, and a lot of the, I'm going back now, a lot of the Spanish soldiers who were stationed in California in the 1770s and the early 19th century married Indias, married Native women.
Okay. Well, that does it. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, and your attention. Thank you, Chris, for your lecture.
Mhm.
And now I will turn this program back to Tom Clays, who will give you some final thoughts. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank our program committee and every individual member of that committee that has worked to make this lecture possible, including Steve Loper, Libby Motika, and Allison Knight. Thank you very much. We couldn't put on these programs without you. I want to thank our sponsor, Redcar and Jim Jacobson again. Our next lecture should be in the beginning of February, so watch out for an email on that. And if you're interested in reviewing this lecture or prior lectures, they're available on our website. I want to thank those of you that made a donation to the Conservancy in conjunction with this lecture. Because of COVID and the events we can no longer conduct, we have lost about 70% of our revenue. So any donation at whatever level will really make a difference for us in supporting our important work. To learn more about what we do and to join or make a donation, please go to www.smconservancy.org. And with that, thank you for joining us tonight and have a wonderful holiday. Bye-bye.